Picture this. You are sitting alone in a quiet room. Nothing dramatic is happening. No breakthrough, no emotional surge, no sense of arrival. Just you, a cup of something warm, and the ordinary texture of an ordinary afternoon. And something feels different. Not elevated, not expansive, not illuminated in the way you once imagined awakening would feel. Just still, but not peaceful in the way people describe peace. Not the kind of stillness that feels like a reward. Something quieter than that. Something almost unsettling in its simplicity. Because the mind, when it has been conditioned to seek movement, growth, progress, does not immediately recognize stillness as completion. It questions it. And so a thought appears, soft, uninvited, almost easy to miss. What if I've lost something? What if the intensity, the fire, the sense that something meaningful was always happening, has simply faded? What if this isn't peace? What if this is emptiness? And that question, if you've ever felt it, is where the misunderstanding begins. Because no one prepares you for this part. The beginning of awakening is easy to recognize. It's disruptive, loud in its own way. It breaks things. It removes identities. It forces you to confront parts of yourself you were never meant to see all at once. It feels like something is happening. And because it feels like something is happening, it's easy to trust. There's movement, there's friction, there's evidence. But what almost nobody talks about is what happens when that movement ends, when the friction disappears, when the process that once defined your entire inner world simply stops. Not dramatically, not with a final moment of clarity, but quietly, like something that no longer needs to continue. And that is the moment most people misinterpret, because they were taught that awakening is expansion, endless expansion, more awareness, more depth, more intensity, more becoming. But Jung pointed to something far more difficult to accept. That the true endpoint of this process does not look like more. It looks like less urgency, less internal noise, less need to understand everything, less need to become anything at all. And that less, to a mind that has spent years identifying with growth, feels like loss. But it isn't loss. It is subtraction, and subtraction reveals something that growth was covering. Because for a long time, you were becoming, layer after layer, insight after insight, identity after identity. Even if those identities were spiritual, they were still structure, still something to hold on to, still something to define yourself through. But what happens when even that disappears? When there is nothing left to refine, nothing left to fix, nothing left to chase? That is where Jung's insight becomes unavoidable. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not partially, not the parts that align with your idea of who you should be, completely, without improvement as a condition, without transformation as a requirement, without the promise that something greater is waiting if you keep going. Just this, as it is. And that moment does not feel like triumph. It feels ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary, because the mind was expecting something else, something that would confirm that everything you went through had a visible result, something that would prove you had reached somewhere. But what you find instead is that there is nowhere to reach, and that realization creates a very specific kind of silence, not emptiness, not absence, but the absence of striving. And without striving, the identity you built around becoming has nothing to attach to. That is why it feels like something is missing, because something is. The version of you that needed to become something else is no longer active, and without that version, there is no tension, no friction, no constant internal movement, just presence. And presence, without tension, can feel unfamiliar at first, because, for most of your life, tension was normal. The need to improve, the need to understand, the need to move forward. Even spiritually, it never stopped. It just changed form. It became more refined, more subtle, more acceptable. But still there, still driving, still pushing. And now, for the first time, that movement has stopped. Not because you gave up, but because there is nothing left for it to hold on to. And that is where the real shift begins. Not when everything starts, but when everything stops. And if you're still here, if something in this doesn't feel like information, but recognition, then you already understand this is not something you can go back from. Because once you see this clearly, you can no longer mistake movement for meaning. You can no longer confuse intensity with depth. You can no longer believe that becoming more is the same as being complete. And that changes the way you see everything that comes next. Because what we are about to move into is not the beginning of awakening. It is what remains when awakening no longer needs to continue. And that is where everything becomes quietly, irreversibly different. And this is where the shift becomes even more difficult to recognize. Because what begins to dissolve now is not something painful. It is something meaningful, something you built carefully, something that for a long time gave your inner world structure. Sign 2. You begin to lose the identity of someone who is healing. And this one is rarely talked about honestly. Not because it is complicated, but because it touches something almost sacred to the people who have walked this path seriously. Think about someone for a moment, not abstractly, specifically. Someone who has spent years doing the work, not superficially, not occasionally, but consistently. Journals filled and refilled, each page an attempt to understand something just slightly more clearly than before. Mornings shaped around practices that were once unfamiliar, now almost ritualistic in their precision. Breathwork, somatic awareness, careful attention to emotional patterns. A life slowly reorganized around the idea that healing was not just something you did, but something you were. And for a long time, that identity holds everything together. It gives direction, it gives meaning. It creates a sense of movement that feels deeply aligned with something true. But then something subtle begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet absence. A morning where the journal stays closed, where the pull toward reflection is not there in the same way, where the need to process, to analyze, to go deeper, simply does not arise. And what replaces it is not clarity, it is space. And that space can feel unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because for so long, your sense of self was organized around the act of healing, around becoming, around working through something. And now, without that movement, there is a question that emerges almost immediately. If I am no longer the one who is healing, then who am I? Jung described this with a precision that is difficult to ignore. Identification with the wound, not just experiencing pain, but building identity around the process of moving through it. And there is a reason this happens, a deeply human one. Because the story of healing does something powerful. It gives coherence to chaos. It turns suffering into narrative. It transforms something that once felt meaningless into something that can be understood, shared, even respected. And over time, that narrative becomes structural. It becomes the way you explain yourself, the way you relate to others, the way you locate yourself in the world. So leaving it is not simple, because it does not feel like growth. It feels like erasure. If the story ends, what replaces it? If you are no longer the one who went through something, the one who is working through something, the one who is actively becoming something, then how do you define yourself? What do you say when someone asks you what has been shaping your life? And beneath that question, there is something even quieter, something more difficult to admit. If I am no longer defined by what I went through, do I still have meaning? This is where most people hesitate, not consciously, but structurally, because the wound, over time, becomes load-bearing. It holds parts of the identity in place. It justifies certain ways of being. It creates a framework that, while painful, is familiar. And familiarity, even when it hurts, feels safer than absence. But what lives on the other side of that is something entirely different. Not a better identity, not a more refined version of the same story, but the absence of needing one. And that is what makes it so difficult to recognize, because the mind is still looking for structure, still looking for something to hold on to, something that says, this is who I am now. But what begins to emerge instead is something far less defined, far less constructed, something that does not rely on narrative to exist, just presence. The person who has genuinely moved through this can still speak about everything that happened, every detail, every moment that once felt unbearable. But the story no longer organizes who they are. It no longer sits at the center. It no longer defines their movement. It is simply something that happened, not something they are. And that shift is almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it changes everything. Because now there is no need to return to it repeatedly. No need to revisit it to understand yourself. No need to keep processing something that has already completed its function. The map is no longer needed, because you are no longer trying to reach the place it was pointing to. You are already there. And that realization often comes quietly, in moments that feel almost insignificant. A morning where nothing pulls you inward. An afternoon where you realize you have not thought about your process all day. A subtle recognition that something that once defined your inner life is no longer active in the same way. And for a moment, that can feel like loss. But it isn't. It is space. Real space. The kind that was not available before. Because before, everything was organized around movement, around becoming, around transformation. And now, without that structure, something else has room to appear. Not the self you were, not the self you were trying to become, but something much quieter. Something that does not need to be constructed. Something that does not need to be explained. Just yourself, as you actually are. And that is when you begin to recognize this threshold. Not through insight, not through a clear realization, but through the absence of needing to define yourself at all. You move through a day without thinking of yourself as someone who is healing, or growing, or working through something. You are simply here. And that simplicity is what most people spend years trying to reach, without realizing that reaching it requires letting go of the identity that was trying to get there. And that is what leads us into something even more difficult to face. Because once the identity of healing dissolves, you begin to see something that was always there, but hidden behind it. Something the entire structure was protecting you from seeing too clearly. Sign 3 is where that begins to reveal itself. And this is where something far more subtle begins to reveal itself. Because once the identity of healing starts to dissolve, what remains is not clarity, it is exposure. Not exposure of what was wrong, but exposure of what was hidden inside what felt right. Sign 3. You begin to see the shadow of the spiritual path itself. And this is not an easy realization. Not because it is complex, but because it asks you to look at something you once trusted completely and see it without distortion. There is a very specific pattern Jung observed repeatedly, not in theory, in people. People who had genuinely gone deep, who had done the work, who understood the language, who could articulate the psyche with precision. And yet, something in them had not changed. Not fundamentally, just refined, more subtle, more difficult to detect, because the ego does not disappear when awakening begins. It adapts, it learns, it reorganizes itself around whatever structure is available. And when spirituality becomes that structure, the ego does something remarkably sophisticated. It hides inside it, not as arrogance, but as awareness, not as superiority, but as insight. And that is what makes it almost invisible from the inside, because it does not feel like ego anymore. It feels like truth. And that is where inflation begins. Jung called it spiritual inflation, not enlightenment, not awakening. Inflation, something expanded beyond its actual grounding, something filled with more meaning than it can honestly hold. And the person inside it rarely recognizes it as distortion, because parts of it are real. That is what makes it convincing. They are more aware in certain ways. They do see things others don't. They have access to language, to patterns, to frameworks that genuinely expand perception. But that awareness is not yet integrated. It is used to maintain something, used to position the self, used to protect something deeper that has not yet been faced. And so, a very specific dynamic begins to form. The person who speaks about consciousness, but cannot tolerate being challenged. The person who understands projection, but cannot see their own. The person who can describe the shadow, but cannot sit with their own discomfort without reframing it. And none of this appears as contradiction from the inside, because the language is coherent. The structure makes sense. Everything sounds like growth, but underneath, something remains unchanged. Not because they are failing, but because something is being avoided in a more sophisticated way. That is what makes this stage so important, because it is the first time the path itself becomes visible as something that can be used, not just something that reveals. And when you begin to see that, the reaction is not what most people expect. It is not shame. It is not collapse. It is something much quieter, something closer to recognition. You look back at years of seeking, years of learning, years of refining your inner world, and you begin to notice something that was always there. Moments where the path became a substitute for something simpler. Moments where depth replaced honesty. Moments where insight replaced action. Moments where understanding became a way of not changing. And when you see that clearly, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that cannot be undone. Because now, you are no longer identified with the path itself. You can appreciate it, without needing it to define you. You can see its value and its limitations at the same time. And that ability is what marks the difference between someone still inside the process and someone who has begun to move beyond it. Because now, you are not using the language to protect yourself. You are using awareness to see yourself. And seeing yourself clearly does not produce superiority. It produces humility, not the performative kind, not the kind that tries to appear grounded, but the kind that comes from recognizing how easily the mind can construct identity, even around something as subtle as awakening. And that is where something changes at a deeper level. You no longer feel the need to position yourself as more aware. You no longer feel the need to evaluate where others are. You no longer feel the need to define who is awake and who is not, because that entire framework begins to feel unnecessary, almost simplistic, compared to what you are now seeing, which is that awareness is not a position. It is not something you reach and hold. It is something that deepens as identification dissolves. And the moment you claim it as identity, it stops deepening. That is why Jung warned about this stage so precisely, not because awakening is false, but because the belief that you have arrived is where the process quietly stops. And what replaces it is not growth. It is maintenance. Maintenance of an identity that feels like truth, but is no longer evolving. So when this stage genuinely matures, something very specific happens. You begin to see your own past participation in it, without defensiveness, without needing to justify it, without needing to reject it. You can recognize, with a kind of quiet amusement, how many times the path itself was used to avoid something simpler, more direct, more uncomfortable, like having a difficult conversation instead of analyzing it, like changing behavior instead of understanding it, like showing up differently instead of explaining why you don't. And that recognition does not diminish the path. It clarifies it. It places it in its proper context, as something that served you, but was never meant to define you. And when that becomes clear, the seeker becomes quieter, not because there is nothing left to learn, but because there is nothing left to prove. And in that quiet, something more honest begins to emerge. Not structured, not labeled, not explained, just direct. And that is what prepares you for the next shift. Because what comes next is not about seeing the path differently. It is about seeing growth itself differently. And that is where almost everything you have been taught begins to unravel. And this is where something even more uncomfortable begins to surface. Because once you see the shadow of the path, you are left with something that feels almost impossible to accept. Not about the past, not about what you misunderstood, but about what you are still doing, right now, without noticing. Sign 4. You stop trying to become better, and paradoxically, that is when real change finally begins. This is the point where almost everything you have been taught about growth starts to feel subtly misaligned. Not wrong, but incomplete, because the entire structure of modern self-development, spiritual or otherwise, is built on a very specific assumption that you are not yet enough, not explicitly, not in a way that sounds harsh, but structurally, quietly, embedded in the language. There is always another layer, another pattern, another habit, another version of yourself that exists just slightly ahead, waiting to be reached, and the pursuit of that version becomes the center of your inner life. At first, this feels meaningful. It gives direction. It gives purpose. It creates movement. But over time, that movement becomes something else. Pressure. Not obvious pressure. Not the kind you would immediately recognize as harmful, but a constant, low-level tension. The sense that where you are is not quite where you should be. That there is always something left to fix, something left to refine, something left to become. And that tension, if sustained long enough, begins to distort the very thing it is trying to improve. Because growth driven by pressure is not growth, it is correction. And correction always implies something is wrong. Jung saw this with a clarity that is difficult to sit with honestly. He understood that much of what people call self-improvement is not acceptance evolving into change. It is rejection trying to disguise itself as evolution, a refined form of self-avoidance. Because as long as you are trying to become something else, you never have to fully be what you are. You never have to sit without movement, without strategy, without the next step ready. And that is where the real difficulty begins. Because stopping feels like failure, not externally, internally. It feels like you are abandoning the process, like you are losing discipline, like you are regressing. But what is actually happening is something far more precise. The mechanism that was driving your growth is being exposed, and that mechanism was not curiosity. It was fear. Fear of not being enough as you are. Fear of being incomplete. Fear of arriving at a point where nothing needs to be done, and realizing you do not know how to exist there. So the mind keeps moving, keeps improving, keeps refining, not because it is natural, but because stillness feels threatening. And this is where Jung's insight becomes unavoidable. He spoke about a principle that feels almost paradoxical when you first encounter it: enantiodromia, the idea that anything pushed to its extreme will eventually turn into its opposite. And nowhere is this more visible than in the pursuit of growth. The person who never stops improving never arrives. The person who treats every moment of contentment as incomplete never experiences completion. The person who is always becoming never simply is. And over time, that creates something very specific. Exhaustion, not physical, not even emotional in an obvious way. Something deeper, a kind of quiet depletion, where the entire process that once felt meaningful begins to feel heavy, not because growth is wrong, but because the way it is being approached is unsustainable. There is a moment, and it is usually subtle, where this becomes undeniable, where you realize you have been working on yourself for years, and something essential has not changed, not because you failed, but because you never stopped. And stopping is the one thing the system never teaches, because there is nothing to sell in stopping. There is nothing to optimize, nothing to improve, nothing to measure, just presence. And presence, without a project, feels unfamiliar, almost empty. But that emptiness is not absence. It is space, the same space that appeared when the identity of healing dissolved. But now, it is deeper, because now, it is not just the identity that is gone. It is the movement itself, the constant forward motion, the quiet urgency, the sense that something must always be happening. And when that disappears, something else begins to emerge, not as a breakthrough, not as a realization, but as a shift in how you exist. You still grow, but the growth is no longer forced. It is not driven by correction. It is not fueled by dissatisfaction. It is not organized around becoming something else. It happens the way a living system naturally evolves, without pressure, without urgency, without the need to justify itself, like a tree growing, not because it is trying to become a better tree, but because growth is simply what happens when nothing is interfering with it, and that is the difference. Before, you were trying to grow. Now, you are allowing growth, and those are not the same thing, because allowing requires something that trying does not. Trust, not trust in an outcome, not trust that everything will work out. Trust in yourself as you are, right now, without adjustment, without improvement, without the next step. And that trust is what removes the pressure completely, because now there is nothing to fix, nothing to chase, nothing to reach. There is only this, and if you can stay here, without needing to move away from it, without needing to improve it, without needing to become something else, then something very specific begins to happen. Change, real change, not constructed, not strategic, not forced, natural, unavoidable. Because once resistance disappears, transformation becomes effortless, and that is what most people spend years trying to achieve, without realizing it cannot be achieved through effort, only through acceptance. Deep enough, that effort is no longer necessary. And if something in this feels uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it removes something you are still holding on to, then you are exactly where this shift begins, because this is the point where growth stops being something you do and becomes something that happens. And that prepares you for what comes next, because once the pressure to become disappears, you begin to experience something that used to feel impossible. Silence, not as absence, but as home. And this is where something begins to feel almost impossible to describe with precision, because what changes now is not what you understand. It is how you experience being with yourself. Sign 5. Silence begins to feel like home. Not the idea of silence, not the kind of silence people describe as peaceful, but the actual, lived experience of being alone, without needing to fill the space. And for most of your life, that was not neutral. It was uncomfortable, not always in an obvious way, but in a way that made you reach, almost automatically, for something else. A voice, a sound, a distraction. Not because you were anxious, not because something was wrong, but because the silence itself carried something you had not yet fully met. Something unfinished, something unresolved. And so, without even thinking about it, you filled it. A podcast while doing something simple, music in the background, a screen lighting up the moment nothing else was happening, not as avoidance in the way people usually describe it, but as habit. A quiet habit of never being completely alone with your own interior, because for a long time, your interior was not a stable place to rest. It was active, full of movement, full of questions, full of things that were still trying to surface. And in the early stages of awakening, this becomes even more intense, not less, because as awareness increases, so does sensitivity. Things that were once below the threshold become visible, audible, present, and the silence gets louder, not externally, internally, which is why so many people become more restless after beginning what they believed would bring them peace, because what was always there is now impossible to ignore. And this is the part nobody prepares you for, that the path toward quiet first makes everything inside you more audible, but something changes, not suddenly, not through effort, through completion, gradual, almost imperceptible at first. The things that once filled the silence begin to lose their intensity. The questions stop looping. The emotional residue stops surfacing in the same way, not because it was suppressed, but because it has already been met, already been seen, already been integrated enough that it no longer needs to push forward. And one day, in a moment that feels almost insignificant, you notice something. You are sitting. Nothing is playing. Nothing is distracting you. And for the first time, you are not reaching for anything, not out of discipline, not because you are trying to be present, because there is nothing inside the silence that needs to be avoided. And that moment, if you recognize it, is not small. It is structural, because it means something very specific has happened. Your interior has become a place you can inhabit, not manage, not improve, not observe from a distance. Inhabit. And that changes everything. Because now, you are no longer dependent on external input to regulate your inner state. You are not reaching for something to stabilize yourself. You are already stable. And from that place, silence is no longer empty. It is full, not with noise, not with thought, but with presence. The kind of presence that does not need to announce itself. The kind that does not feel like achievement, but like arrival. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a way that feels almost inevitable, like something you have been moving toward, without knowing exactly what it would look like when you got there. And that is when something else begins to shift, because once silence becomes a place you can rest, you begin to outgrow something else, something that was once essential, something that shaped how you understood everything. Sign 6. You begin to outgrow your teachers, not with rejection, not with superiority, but with clarity. And this is where things become uncomfortable in a different way, because for a long time, your understanding of yourself was mediated through language, through frameworks, through ideas that gave structure to what you were experiencing. Jung, Toll, Watts, Campbell, voices that articulated something you felt before you had words for it. And those frameworks were necessary. They gave orientation, they gave context, they helped you recognize patterns you would not have seen on your own. But over time, something changes. You begin to notice a subtle shift in how you engage with them. Not less respect, not less appreciation, but less dependence. You read something, and instead of needing it to explain your experience, you recognize where it aligns and where it doesn't, without tension, without needing to force agreement, without needing to resolve the difference. And that is when something becomes clear. The framework was never the truth. It was a way of approaching it, a map, and maps are only useful until you can walk the territory directly. Jung himself was explicit about this. Learn your theories well, but put them aside when you touch the miracle of the living soul, because he understood something that many of his followers forget, that the moment a framework becomes fixed, it stops being alive, and anything that stops being alive stops being true in the way it once was. That is why he contradicted himself, not by accident, deliberately, because he refused to let his ideas become a structure people could hide inside. And now, you begin to understand why. Because once you have direct contact with your own interior, you no longer need translation. You no longer need to run what you feel through someone else's language to know what it means. And that is where something fundamental shifts. You are no longer relating to yourself through interpretation. You are relating to yourself directly. And direct contact is something no framework can replace, because it is alive. It changes. It moves. It does not fit perfectly into any system, no matter how sophisticated that system is. And that realization does not disconnect you from what you learned. It frees you from needing it to define you. You can return to it, appreciate it, see its depth, see its brilliance, but you are no longer inside it. You are standing outside it, in direct relationship with your own experience. And that is where something becomes undeniable. You are no longer seeking understanding. You are living it, and that prepares you for the final shift. Because what remains, after the path, the identity, the growth, the silence, and the frameworks, is something most people never fully arrive at. Not because it is hidden, but because it requires letting go of everything that once made sense. And that is where this entire process was always leading. And this is where something becomes quietly undeniable, not because it announces itself, but because you no longer need to question it in the same way. What once felt like guidance now feels like something you can stand within directly. Sign 6. You begin to outgrow your teachers, and this is not rebellion. It is not rejection. It is not the kind of distancing that comes from thinking you have moved beyond something. It is something far more precise than that. You can feel genuine gratitude for what something gave you, real appreciation, not intellectual, not performative, but lived, because you remember exactly what it allowed you to see when you could not yet see it on your own. You remember what it clarified, what it opened, what it made possible. And at the same time, something else becomes equally clear, that it no longer contains you completely, not because it is limited in some objective sense, but because you are no longer relating to yourself through it. And holding those two realities at once is where something shifts permanently. Because before, you needed alignment. You needed the framework to fit. You needed your experience to make sense inside something structured. And now, you don't. You can read something that once felt like it held everything and see exactly where it is precise and where it no longer maps cleanly onto your own experience. Without tension, without needing to resolve the difference, without needing to decide which one is right. And that absence of tension is what marks the shift. Because it means something fundamental has changed. You are no longer organizing yourself around the map. You are moving within the territory, and the territory is not fixed. It is not static. It does not stay aligned with any system for long. It changes. It unfolds. It contradicts itself. It reveals things that no framework can fully anticipate. And once you are in direct contact with that, something becomes unnecessary. Translation. You no longer need to interpret your experience through someone else's language to trust what it means. You no longer need to confirm what you feel by checking if it fits a known pattern. You simply recognize it directly. And that direct recognition is what creates authority. Not the kind that positions itself above others. Not the kind that needs to be acknowledged, but the kind that is internal, stable, unshaken by disagreement, unshaken by uncertainty, because it is not built on conclusion, it is built on contact. And that is why this stage is so often misunderstood, because from the outside, it can look like detachment, like distance, like losing interest, but internally, it is the opposite. It is deeper involvement, just without dependence, without the need to be guided in the same way, without the need to be told what something means. And that is what Jung was pointing to when he warned about turning living insight into fixed doctrine, because he understood something most people resist, that the moment a truth becomes fixed, it begins to lose contact with reality, not because it becomes false, but because it stops evolving. And anything that stops evolving eventually becomes insufficient. So when you outgrow something, you are not betraying it. You are completing it. You are doing exactly what it was meant to lead you toward, not staying inside it, but moving beyond it. And that movement is what creates something very specific. Humility, not the kind that makes you smaller, the kind that removes the need to be certain. Because now you understand something that cannot be learned intellectually. That knowing is always partial, that understanding is always evolving, that no system, no matter how deep, can fully contain the reality of lived experience. And once you see that clearly, something relaxes. You no longer need to arrive at final answers. You no longer need to define everything precisely. You no longer need to hold a fixed position about who you are or what you understand, because now you trust your ability to meet whatever arises without needing it to fit something predetermined. And that trust is what replaces seeking, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, until one day, you notice something. You are no longer looking for the next insight, the next framework, the next explanation that will complete something, not because there is nothing left to understand, but because there is nothing left that needs to be resolved before you can live. And that realization is where something closes. Not the path, not the process, but the dependence on it. And in that closing, something else opens, not as a concept, not as an idea, but as a way of existing. And if you have ever felt that shift, even briefly, even in a moment that seemed too simple to matter, then you already know what this is pointing to. That quiet recognition that you are no longer waiting to become someone who can live your life. You are already here. And if that feels familiar, not as an idea, but as something you have touched directly, then you have already crossed a threshold most people spend years circling. And if that recognition is yours, leave 777, not as a symbol of arrival, but as a marker of something much more subtle, the moment where guidance becomes internal, and the need to be led begins to dissolve, because what comes next is not about understanding more. It is about something far more difficult to accept, the end of the search itself. And that is where almost everything people believe about awakening begins to fall away. And this is where everything becomes almost too simple for the mind to recognize. Because after everything you have moved through, after all the layers you questioned, examined, dismantled, after all the effort that once felt necessary just to understand yourself, what remains does not look like a conclusion. It looks like this, just this, not managed, not analyzed, not observed from a distance, lived. And that is what makes it so easy to miss. Because there is no signal that tells you that you have crossed something, no moment that confirms, this is it. No external marker that distinguishes this from any other ordinary day. There is only a quiet shift, one that removes the need to stand outside your own life. And for most people, that is unfamiliar. Because for so long, you were not fully inside your experience. You were watching it, interpreting it, trying to understand what it meant, what it was leading toward, what it said about who you were becoming. Even in the deepest stages of growth, there was still a subtle distance, a layer of observation between you and what was happening. And now, that layer is gone. Not because you removed it intentionally, but because it no longer serves a function. There is nothing left that needs to be translated, nothing left that requires interpretation before it can be felt. And so you stop managing the experience of being alive. You stop preparing yourself to live. You stop positioning yourself for some future version of life that will finally feel complete. You simply have it, directly, without resistance, without commentary, without needing to shape it into something more meaningful than it already is. And that you is what everything was moving toward, not a higher state, not a more elevated version of yourself, but the ability to be fully here without needing it to be anything else, because what you begin to understand now is that nothing was ever missing, only filtered through expectation, through identity, through the need for something more. And once those filters fall away, what remains is not extraordinary. It is ordinary in a way that feels almost disarming, because it does not confirm the story the mind expected. It does not reward you with a sense of arrival. It does not elevate you above anything. It brings you back, fully, into what was always here. And that is why Jung's insight matters so much at this point. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. But later, he moved beyond even that, because becoming itself is still movement, still direction, still something the mind can hold on to. And what he pointed to in the end was something quieter. That individuation does not remove you from life. It gathers life back into you, not as something you control, not as something you understand completely, but as something you finally allow. And when that happens, the fire you once felt does not disappear. It changes. It settles. It stops needing to prove itself. It stops burning in a way that demands attention and becomes something else entirely. Steady, warm, reliable, a presence rather than a performance. And that is why this does not look like enlightenment from the outside, because nothing about it needs to be seen. There is no display, no signal, no identity built around it, just a person, fully inside their own life, responding, feeling, moving, without needing to step outside of it to understand what it means. And that simplicity is what most people spend years trying to reach, without realizing it cannot be reached through effort, only through the gradual dissolving of everything that made it seem distant. So if something in this did not just make sense, but felt familiar, in a way that is difficult to explain, then you already know, not intellectually, directly, and that recognition is enough, because it means you are no longer searching for yourself. You are living from yourself, and that is the difference that changes everything. So if one of these signs was not just something you understood, but something you recognized in your own experience, leave your number, not as proof, not as identity, but as a quiet acknowledgement that you have seen something, you cannot unsee. And if you know someone, still inside the movement, still trying to reach what you now understand cannot be reached that way, share this with them. Because sometimes, the most honest thing you can offer someone is not a solution, but the reminder that what they are moving toward is real and worth every step it takes to arrive. And if you are still here, then you already know. This was never about becoming someone else. It was about finally being here, as you are, without leaving.